and I did my honors project on Beatrice 6, which all our 6 individuals were wrongfully convicted in the state of Nebraska. So let's get started. So first off, let's figure out what a wrongful conviction is. A wrongful conviction is when someone is found guilty of a crime and they should not have been found guilty in the first place. So there are 2 different ways you can have a wrongful conviction. The first way is that there was a procedural error. So that means that something went wrong throughout the process and it should have resulted in a mistrial. So an example of this is we have Lydia Diane Jones. She was found guilty in the state of Alabama in the year 2000. She was convicted for the charges of drug trafficking and sentenced to life in prison without the chance of parole. She was released in 2006, and the reason that this counts as a procedural error is because she had inadequate counsel. And the reasoning for that is because her attorney was also the attorney for her boyfriend, who was being charged for the exact same crime, and they favored him over her, and so she was pretty much the fall guy. The next one is Walter McMillan. Now, he goes with both being actually innocent, he did not commit the crime, and with the procedural error, so we'll go over why he's with the procedural side too. So he was convicted in 1988 in the state of Alabama. He was sentenced to death, and his crime was murder. So he was released in 1993 before they were able to put him to death. However, this was a huge battle because they were trying to put an execution date in place for him throughout this. So it was kind of a battle against the clock, and they kept trying to get states of execution for him. So the reason his counts as a procedural error is because the prosecutors withheld exculpatory evidence, which is evidence that would help prove his innocence in the case. They also had witnesses that lied on the stand, witnesses that lied to the investigators, and the prosecutor moved jurisdictions to prevent potential black jurors from being selected for jury duty. And then they also struck jurors just based on the color of their skin, which is illegal. So that should have resulted in a mistrial. So the other reason somebody can have a wrongful conviction is because they are actually innocent of the crimes that they are being charged with. So an example of this would be Ray Crum. He was convicted in 1992 in the state of Arizona. He was sentenced to death as well as 21 years, plus that. He was released in 2002 before he was executed. Some contributing factors to his exoneration was DNA testing. And the reason that he was found guilty was bite mark evidence. Now, bite mark evidence is not considered reliable in the courts or the field of forensics anymore. But they had an expert witness get on the stand and say that it was, and that's why he was found guilty. But with the DNA evidence later on, he was revealed that he did not commit the crimes of kidnapping, sexual assault, or murder. So now we have a publicly innocent case. Now, Cameron Todd Willingham was convicted in the state of Texas in 1991. He was sentenced to death. His crimes were murder and arson. He was accused of purposely setting fire to his house, which resulted in the death of his daughters about a week or 2 before Christmas. He was executed in 2004, sadly, and part of the reason he was convicted was, once again, expert testimony. Scientists have since studied the case, and they were studying it in 2004 and told the state of Texas that they believed that there was absolutely no possibility that this case was arson. It was a complete accidental fire with the Christmas tree starting on fire, and that's what happened. However, the state of Texas will not admit that they were wrong in executing him or convicting him. They have revamped their forensics with arson investigations, and a judge did move to exonerate him, but the higher Texas courts blocked it and said he didn't have jurisdiction to do that. So he has not been pardoned yet. Another case that's publicly innocent is Marcellus Williams. This is a very recent case. So he was convicted in the state of Missouri in 2001. He was given a death sentence. The crimes he was accused of were murder, robbery, and burglary. He was executed this last fall in 2024. His case goes with the procedural error because the police mishandled the murder weapon, and so they weren't able to use the DNA that was on the murder weapon, and that's the only area that there was DNA to be tested. And they've also blocked potential jurors based on race in this case, which is automatically should be a mistrial since it is illegal. So reasons for doubt for his guilt is that there was absolutely no DNA that placed him at the crime. The state paid witnesses to testify against him. The previous governor of Missouri had reopened the investigation to look into whether or not he was actually guilty, and when a new governor got elected, he got rid of the investigation and the stay of execution that was put in place, and the state of Missouri did execute him. And even the prosecutor in this case admitted that since the jury selection was wrong, it should result in a wrongful conviction. So then we also have a potential case. This is Robert Robertson. He was convicted in the state of Texas in 2002. He was given a death sentence for murder. He was accused of murdering his daughter, Nikki. The execution, as of right now, he has a stay that's like temporarily in place. So contributing factors for his conviction was inaccurate testimony. So the reasons for doubt is that studies have now shown that his daughter's death does not fit a shaken baby syndrome case. It actually fits the medical issues that she had at the time. She was also on medication that was believed to be safe at the time. However, they will not give this medication out to young children anymore because of the detrimental side effects. So now let's get into the Beatrice 6. Beatrice 6 is a case in Nebraska where 3 men and 3 women were wrongfully accused and convicted of the murder of Helen Wilson. You are going to be the first female on death row. That is what was told to Ada Joanne Taylor during multiple of her interrogations by the police as a way to convince her to confess to a crime that she did not actually commit. So February 5th, 1985 was the date of the crime. Helen Wilson was an elderly woman, and she was found murdered and sexually assaulted in her apartment in Beatrice, Nebraska. Throughout 1985, the investigation was launched by the police. DNA from the scene was sent in for testing, and police questioned and released Bruce Allen Smith, who was the actual murderer of Helen Wilson. He was released because when the DNA evidence came back, the forensic scientist that tested the material had actually made a mistake, and so his DNA did not match at the time. This investigator has since been fired because she messed up on over 40 different cases that resulted in wrongful convictions throughout the United States. So then the investigation went cold in 1985. However, local farmer Burdett Searcy launched his own investigation into the case, looking into the town drunks that he figured committed the crime. So in 1987, Jerry DeWitt was elected sheriff in Gage County. Beatrice is in Gage County, for those of you who are unaware. And Sheriff DeWitt hired Burdett Searcy as a deputy. In January of 1989, Deputy Searcy finally got approval to relaunch the investigation into the Wilson murder. And he used Wayne Price as someone to help him in this investigation. Wayne Price was also the psychologist in Gage County and had worked with multiple members of Beatrice 6 previously with their mental conditions. So that's a clear conflict of interest, however, they went with it anyways. So Lisa Podendorf is one of Deputy Searcy's key informants. She said that Ada Joanne Taylor admitted to the crime. However, when she went through the timeline of events, her timeline was off by multiple hours. She also claimed that she saw White, Winslow, Taylor, Cliff Sheldon, Deborah Sheldon, Beth Johnson, Mark Goodson, and Charlotte Bishop the night of the crime hanging around Helen Wilson's house. However, many of those individuals had an airtight alibi, could not have been there, and from where she said she was standing, it was impossible for her to have seen that location. Knowing all of this, Deputy Searcy just omitted the parts that did not fit the crime and rolled with his investigation anyways. In February of 1989, Searcy began interviewing Thomas Winslow while he was in jail in Lincoln for a different crime that he had committed that was not connected to this case. Winslow then claimed that he loaned his car to Cliff Sheldon, Taylor, and White that night. However, Cliff Sheldon was hospitalized at the time, so it was absolutely impossible for him to have had the car. But Deputy Searcy just left out Cliff Sheldon in his report and went with it anyways. Also in February, Searcy interviewed Charlotte Bishop. Charlotte Bishop also claimed that Taylor admitted that she was guilty and had seen police cars at Helen Wilson's apartment. However, her timeline was off by an entire day. And once again, Deputy Searcy just rolled with it and left out the parts where the timeline didn't line up. So in March of 1989, arrest warrants were secured for Taylor and White, who were out of the state. White, Taylor, Winslow, Johnson, Deborah Sheldon, Cliff Sheldon were all interviewed by Deputy Searcy. However, none of their stories matched the crime, none of their stories matched each other's, and all of them said that they did not commit this crime. And Deputy Searcy just kept rolling with it and trying to force them to admit to the crime. And then there were discrepancies that started appearing in the reports and the footage, because all of these interrogations were interviewed. However, when you look at the interviews and you look at the reports, there's stuff in the reports that weren't in the interviews. And Price was helping with these interviews and claiming he would help people through dreams to remember that they committed the crimes, which is a clear conflict of interest, and there were very large breaks in the interview process. So they would start off saying that they did not commit this crime. Deputy Searcy would get mad, there would be a long break in the footage, and then when they got back on camera, they were now admitting the crime. And they were saying, okay, maybe I did help with this. So then in April of 1989, Deborah Sheldon was interviewed again, and she was arrested. James Dean was arrested and denied a lawyer, even though he asked for one, which is against your Sixth Amendment rights. He was eventually granted an attorney. However, they continued to interrogate him without his attorney present as well, which is also very, very illegal. So none of that information should have been used anyways. In May of 1989, James Dean continued to be interviewed and shown crime scene footage and photographs of Helen Wilson's murder. Kathleen Gonzalez was arrested and interviewed, and then Kathleen Gonzalez's blood type was similar to that at the crime scene, however, it did not match. But Deputy Searcy just told her it was a match to try to get her to confess to the crime, and eventually she did. So in June of 1989, James Dean continued to be interviewed, and Gonzalez took a polygraph exam, and they told her that she was showing signs of deception. So then in September of 1989, Deborah Sheldon, James Dean, and Ada Joanne Taylor had all pled guilty at that point. And then actually in October of 1989, Kathleen Gonzalez pled no contest to the crimes she was being accused of. In November of 1989, Joseph White was convicted of first-degree murder through a jury trial. Taylor, Dean, Sheldon, and Gonzalez all testified against him at this trial. Thomas Winslow did not want to testify against him because he still could not remember what happened, and he didn't want to say something wrong in court. In December of 1989, Thomas Winslow entered a no-contest plea to the crimes that he was being accused of. So here are their sentences. Deborah Sheldon pled guilty to aiding and abetting second-degree murder in April of 1989. She was sentenced to 10 years in prison. James Dean pled guilty to aiding and abetting second-degree murder in May of 1989 and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Ada Joanne Taylor pled guilty to intentionally killing without premeditation in September of 1989 and was sentenced to 40 years in prison. Kathleen Gonzalez pled no contest in October of 1989 to aiding and abetting second-degree murder, and she got 10 years in prison. Joseph White was found guilty in November for sexual assault and first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the chance of parole. Thomas Winslow pled no contest, to aiding and abetting and intentionally killing without premeditation in December of 1989, and he was sentenced to 50 years in prison. So in 2007, Thomas Winslow and Joseph White were able to get a hold of the DNA from that case and get it retested for their cases. In 2008, Joseph White's conviction was vacated and he was released from prison. And then in October as well, Thomas Winslow's sentence was reduced to time served and he was released from prison. In November, Joseph White's charges were dropped, and as well in November, Ada Joanne Taylor was released on parole. In January 2009, the 5 remaining members of the Beatrice Six were pardoned because, as we saw on the last slide in 2008, Joseph White's charges were dropped. So time lost by the Beatrice Six. As a group, they lost over 70 years of their lives in prison. Deborah Sheldon, James Dean, and Kathleen Gonzalez all lost 5 years because they were released on parole after 5 years. Ada Joanne Taylor and Joseph White lost 19 years of their lives in prison, and then Thomas Winslow lost 18 years of his life in prison. His is a year shorter than the other ones because he pled in December, so he wasn't sentenced until the following year. So compensation. Nebraska's statute for tort claims for wrongful convictions. So Joseph White was the only one who was able to take this up. The state of Nebraska settled on $500,000. However, he only received $25,000 personally because he died in a workplace accident in 2011. However, his family was allowed to collect the remaining amount. And then before he passed away, he started a federal civil rights case and included the other members of the Beatrice Six. Now this was finished in 2016. They were awarded approximately $28.1 million. White, Winslow, and Taylor were all supposed to receive around $7.3 million. Dean and Gonzalez were supposed to get around $2 million, and then Sheldon was supposed to get $1.8, and Joseph White's family was allowed to collect his portion of this. Now, the Gage County appealed this to the higher courts because they didn't know how they were going to come up with $28.1 million that quickly, and the state of Nebraska said, too bad. So they actually had to raise taxes to the highest amount that they were allowed to under law at the time, and they finished paying off the award money in 2023, so that's pretty recent. So an analysis of the Beatrice Six. This is a list of contributing factors that I think led to their wrongful convictions, as well as some red flags that should have alerted everyone that they were not barking up the right tree. So we have police coercion, so we have leading questions. Searcy would show his support or disapproval throughout the interrogations by smiling and nodding or slamming his fists on the table. There were long breaks in the questioning. He would try to lead their answers. There were plenty of false confessions in this case. There were threats of the death penalty in every single one of the interviews and interrogations, which led many of the members of the Beatrice Six to say that they did it to avoid getting the death penalty. There was the conflict of interest with Wayne Price, because he was the past psychologist and was also working as the deputy. There was the false witness testimony, lying about the DNA to Kathleen Gonzalez, the tunnel vision by Deputy Searcy, the mistake with the forensic scientist that messed up the DNA evidence at the beginning, the interview footage and the reports not matching, and then the confessions that did not match the crime or the other suspects' confessions. These are all huge red flags. So in conclusion, I made a little anagram with ACT, so I was pretty proud of that. So I think we need to have more accountability. The states and the government officials need to take more accountability in these wrongful convictions. The prosecutors and sheriffs in many wrongful convictions cases are granted immunity, so you actually can't sue them for what they did, even if it was very intentional and they knowingly put someone away. There also needs to be more compensation. These individuals lost many years of their lives, so states should be more willing to compensate these individuals. There are many states that don't have compensation statutes on the books, so they actually can't receive any money for their wrongful conviction. And then even some of the states that have those statutes just flat out refuse to admit that they were wrong, like with Texas and Cameron Todd Willingham. And then we need to have more testing. So we need to make sure that the tests we use in forensics and our expert testimony is up to date. And some of that can't be helped, as we saw with Robert Robertson. They had no way of knowing that it wasn't good. And DNA evidence wasn't really found out the way we expected to until the 1970s. So it was pretty early to be used in the 1980s. So we've had advancements since then. But we need to make sure that what we're using is accurate to try to prevent some of these wrongful convictions. Thanks. So I'll answer your questions.